everybody. Welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. For today's episode, our guest is Dr. J.P. Elliott. He received his PhD in organizational psychology from Elliott International University, currently works as the CPO for WilliamsMarston, and hosts his very own podcast, The Future of HR. Welcome, JP. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Brandon. Excited to be on the podcast with you guys.
Yeah, no, we're super excited. I feel like the last time we were emailing and talking, it was probably a while back. It was like June. And I think you said you were going on vacation, right?
Yeah, we actually went to St. John's, which is pretty cool. That was the first time we've been there and had a great time as a family. Got out of the water. So love that. So yeah, kids are back in school though. It's August. I don't know when this will come out, but I think summer's over. Get back to work. You guys are getting back to school. So, but it was a great summer.
Yeah, sadly enough. Well, not sadly, but summer's always fun.
Yeah, and for those of you that don't know, JP's been really helpful for Joe and I on the back end, giving us a lot of tips and tricks to help us become better at doing what we do for you guys. So we do appreciate having you on here now, letting it come full circle, JP. So thank you for that.
Well, it's awesome. Well, I mean, the podcast I started was all about inspiring the next generation of HR leaders, and you guys are that, fit the mold, and your listeners do as well. So it's exciting to be able to give back, come on the podcast, and be some other great guests you've had. I know you've had Alan Church and some other folks that I'd like to get on my podcast as well. So it's fun.
I think we had the inspiration to have Dr. Church on from your podcast. I think we had like a lot of inspiration. We're like, oh, look at JP. You got all these so cool people on. And he was, I think, one of our most listened to episodes. Everyone loved what he had to say.
It's really cool too. Like we kind of want to talk to you now, transitioning into kind of what we're going to talk about today. You do have like a very awesome and interesting career path, and talking about HR, CHROs is something in IO that we actually haven't had the opportunity to talk about a lot. So we're really interested to hear about your pathway, and starting with that, like what is like kind of that way that you broke into the field starting from the beginning?
I guess we start back from the beginning. You look about where you kind of grew up, like who your parents were, how you kind of think about what did you want to do when you grow up, right? And most of us didn't know about IO psychology. But I've always, because of my mom and dad, my dad was a PhD in economics from Stanford, but ended up being an entrepreneur and really kind of doing his own thing. He was a good businessman, but he was not his focus. Money wasn't his focus. It was more about kind of having his freedom. But I always really learned business from him. And then my mom was a marriage and family counselor. And so there's always this mix of like people and business and just kind of how my family operated. And so when I got to college and found out there was something called IO psychology, it was like the perfect fit. And if I wasn't doing this, I'd be in marketing. 100% would have got an MBA and probably doing marketing because I do like that as well. But people and making change and making that impact is really what matters for me. So after grad school, I think the funny part about this, and we might, talk more in depth on this area, but I went to grad school not thinking about HR at all, didn't know what HR was, really kind of expected to be a consultant, a business consultant, management consultant. And that was what I kind of wanted to do. I wanted to, really impact the business, but never thought about the human resources side of it. And it wasn't until, you get through grad school and start to understand where most of these consulting companies we're actually working with were HR leaders. And they were the ones that were deciding who came in and who the consultants were. And they were closer to the business. They were making things happen. And that really led to my first internship at Taco Bell. And we can talk about that story a little bit later because I think it's an important story of how I got there. Also tells my age, unfortunately, a little bit. But, that was so amazing because Taco Bell, not only having great food, let's be honest, especially at 2 a.m., the reality is Taco Bell was owned by Yum Brands, which was actually PepsiCo. So everyone there was actually ex-PepsiCo. And it was this incredible experience of this just powerhouse HR team, right? So you think Alan Church, PepsiCo. PepsiCo is an amazing HR factory and has been for a long time. And so when I got in there and I was starting to work as an intern as part of their people development department, so their organization development department, the HR team was just like driving the agenda. And I was totally blown away and really fell in love with HR and the impact you can have. Now, I did leave HR and go back to management consulting because I had to have that bug and I wanted to do it. But, I never really left it too far. I just said, look, that's where it made sense. And so I kind of went back into the HR realm. And really all of what we do is HR. So whether you're in talent management, talent acquisition, compensation, human resource business partner, all of those people are, they're HR. And yeah, so I think it gets a little bit like, for me, you can't muddy the waters because we're on that one team, right? And the business leaders will basically paint the broad brush and be like, you're all HR, right? So, but HR has a different perception, right? There's employee relations and things that we don't like to do, but the strategic side of HR is really exciting.
So it's a really cool pathway you describe, and I like the best thing that we get to do is hear all the different like IO avenues. I feel like everyone has like a slightly different story and how they got to this place. Uh, but one thing I picked up was when you were talking about possibly getting an MBA, and it's a topic that we actually haven't covered yet, which I feel is kind of interesting because they're kind of closely related. Either you get an MBA, and if you didn't get an MBA, you kind of fall into that IO psych grad school avenue. What was the main factor of why you didn't get that MBA? I know you briefly talked about it, but is there like a couple specific things about like that you're like, I have to do IO psychology instead?
Yeah, it's a great question because I guess for two things. Number one, I felt like there's 70,000 MBAs a year. And then maybe the number's even more now, but this is back in the day. And so I've always looked at my career like, how do I differentiate myself? Right? Because one thing I think I learned from my dad and just probably his business background, we'd always say, well, being a teacher is an amazing thing to do, right? It's a great profession, but a lot of people can be a teacher, or there's lots of teachers and there's a need for them. So they're not going to pay teachers that much money. Now, I think teachers deserve a lot more money than they get, but there's rules that are they're spread out. And so when you start thinking about MBAs, there's lots of MBAs, but if you get your MBA from University of Phoenix or you get your MBA from Harvard, it's a big difference. And I didn't have the grades, to be honest, to get in the top 10 schools. And so even though I liked the MBA route, I felt like a PhD was differentiating. It's like what, 1 or 2% of the population get a PhD. I think it was nice you guys called me doctor. I never call myself doctor anymore. Don't think about that. But the reality is a PhD is something they can't take away from you. And so my mom were pushing me to get the PhD because you could write, you could speak, you could do academia if you wanted to, I guess. That wasn't really what I wanted to do, and it just made more sense. But I really just said I can't get to a top 10 school. So frankly, I'm going to have to make a different choice. And I think the PhD was the right choice.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I actually had the similar thought process in the beginning before I went IO because I was like thinking about it. And if you were getting a master's in business, then it was something where you had to specialize to really see the value in it. I felt like too, like, because I was looking maybe sports management side. And then that was where you could maybe take the avenue into a different direction. But then I ultimately obviously chose IO, and you could kind of take that and run with it in so many different ways. But I do kind of want to go back to what you were talking about with your career and how you went HR and then switched to consulting and then back to HR. So that experience was probably invaluable. Like, it was something that was very helpful for you. Could you describe what that shift was like for you to go from HR to consulting?
Yeah, and I think probably is helpful for listeners to understand the full story or scoop. Kind of how I kind of grew my career. And I think for me, differentiation matters. So think about that. I also believe experience matters. And I'll tell a quick side note story before I jump back into a little bit more about my career. When people talk about the 70-20-10, you've probably heard of that, right? 70% of our experiences are, we learn by 70% of experiences, 20% probably learning through others, coaching, mentoring, and 10% through actual learning, like a book, podcast, whatever. Well, experiences are number one. And so I've always believed experience make a big difference. And if you think about two golfers, right? And you've got one golfer that every day for 15 years golfs on the same course, right? They know that course. That's the only golf course they use. You've got another golfer who every weekend goes on a different golf course for 15 years. And now they're going to go play each other in a golf tournament on a different golf course, right? Not the same one, not the home court advantage. Who do you think's going to win, right?
Right.
Probably the person with more experiences, right? And so I've always believed that. So I kind of had that philosophy of my career path and thinking about that. So I spent about 5 years at Taco Bell in the people development department. Obviously, an amazing company. At that point, I was doing organization development, change management, employee engagement surveys, etc. And, I think after the third or fourth year of doing the same engagement survey and same analysis, I feel like I'd mastered a lot of things. And so the move at that point, they said, look, we'll make you an HR business partner, but you've got to move to Louisville, Kentucky, or like Tucson, Arizona. And I was single living in Newport Beach. And so I was not moving to either of those locations for lots of reasons, mostly being single. So I decided to join some friends who had gone to IBM Consulting. And I went to IBM Consulting as an organizational change and strategy consultant. And so now you go from like being a support function to actually a revenue generator, right? They're billing your hourly rate, you're delivering projects, you got to manage your own career. And what I learned there, I saw great HR at Taco Bell, but when I went to IBM, I learned project management. I learned how to manage stakeholder management. I learned how to do massive transformation, process transformations, change. But all the projects were like typically 10 or more $1 million in revenue. The first project I had there was actually IBM was helping Sprint, and we had over 400 consultants on this project. And it was insane. It was like, and the small change team was like maybe 25 people. But great experience. Lots of 100% travel job. You left on Monday mornings or Sunday night. You came back Thursday night. But I learned a lot for those 3 years. In between there, I took an entrepreneurial sabbatical. I had a friend of mine who's a creative director of Warner Brothers and Sesame Street, right? Really, really amazing, talented graphic designer. And he had an idea to pitch Warner Brothers, taking the Ocean's 11 movies, which is getting a little bit older now, making a young men's lifestyle brand, if you've ever seen that movie. And so we went and pitched, and all of a sudden we walked out with $50,000 of work, and we actually started a brand strategy and design company in LA. So I left IBM and did that. It was crazy. It was pretty nuts because we walked out and they were like, well, Brad Pitt's never doing this, and neither is George Clooney. They're not going to give us their license. But hey, we like you guys. And JP, this is the funny part. Can you do focus groups, and can you write a marketing strategy for Wizard of Oz, The Christmas Story, and Goonies? And I was like, sure. And it was like a $50,000 contract. And so I was young and, went for it. And we launched a company, and, 18 months later, we were really successful. I decided to go back because it wasn't where my niche was, but we made, I think, over $400,000 or $500,000 the first 18 months. And we were like profitable and had an office, and he ran the business for another 11 years after that. And, but it was fun. It was a good experience. But I went back to IBM and said, entrepreneur is interesting to be an entrepreneur. Having a business partner is probably more challenging than I'll get into in this podcast. But it was really fun. And my passion was more about, I think HR and having that impact. And then I left IBM after about a year or two, maybe I guess about 15 months. Things had changed. And I went to a smaller boutique human capital consulting firm. And I was making moves, to be honest, because when you get your PhD, by the time I graduated, I was like 28 years old. And I felt like I was behind, to be honest. I was like, I got to catch up. And I think the advice I hear is like, that was a mistake a little bit, because sometimes you're trying to get ahead so quickly versus saying, look, maybe I need to plant some roots here and probably stay a little bit longer, and I probably could have stayed a little bit longer in a couple of those roles potentially, but they weren't the right fit, and it's fine, right? Plus I got married. My wife was not happy about me being gone 100% of the time. And so Simpson Consulting, which was much more talent management, leadership development, was about 25% travel. And that work was really different because now I was actually selling the work, I was leading the work, and I learned how to deliver it, but also work with executives. And so it was a huge experience. That work, one of our main clients at the time was around the recession, 2008. We started doing a lot of work internationally. And so I got a lot of experience with Chevron in Singapore. We did something for Cigna International in 7 Asian countries. And I got this call from a recruiter, and I built a relationship with a recruiter, which is really important early on. And it takes time because no one's going to call you. Recruiters aren't going to call you when you don't have a really big resume yet, because they're really looking to sell you to somebody else, right? But if you can build a relationship, you should. And a recruiter who I'm still great friends with today called me for the job at Lenovo. And it was a director of talent job. And he said, look, I don't know, you're not really the right candidate, but I think you're a good athlete, and I think you could get this job, but you don't have as much experience as anyone else I'm putting up against you. They're all have been in the seat and you haven't. And I got lucky, and I got the director of talent job at Lenovo. That moved my family from California to North Carolina. And that was an incredible experience. When I got there, Lenovo was $14 billion. and we grew to 32 billion in like 3 years that I was there. And I got promoted from director to senior director and had all of the talent work. I had everything except for learning when I left. And honestly would have probably stayed there for a long time, except half my team was in Beijing. So I was on international flights to Beijing or other places in the country once a month. And every night I was on phone calls from 11 p.m. till sometimes sometimes 8 o'clock at night till 1 o'clock in the morning. And then you had to go back and do a normal day. And we had my son was about 6 months when we moved there. And then my daughter was born while we were in North Carolina. And so it was pretty tough on the family. And then I got a phone call from a recruiter for the Brinks company, which is as far away as technology as you can imagine. It's a 100-year-old company moving cash and cash logistics. And I initially said no. I said, no, thanks. And about 3 months later, I was still thinking, I was like, well, I don't know, maybe I should, I was just thinking about the job a little bit. And I literally got a call from the recruiter and said, hey, just please meet with Holly Tyson. She's this new CHRO. She's really progressive, and I think you'll love her. And we had a great conversation. And Holly and I are still really close. And I joined Brinks really to help her. And I went to Brinks to be their VP of talent because it was a different situation again. So whereas Lenovo, being a global Chinese company, if the CEO, sneezed, we all got the cold, right? If you were at Brinks, it was a conglomerate, basically, all these different countries in Brazil and Chile and Europe, all operated independently. And we're now trying to get scale and scope and turn the business around. And in this role, I got global talent acquisition. So I was now responsible for all executive recruiting and exec assessment, which I didn't have before. And I think the first year we replaced 15 leaders across global leadership teams. And so I cut my teeth in executive assessment. I didn't know what a Hogan was before that. I got deep in that. It was really a pivotal time, I think, in that experience. And we did turn the brand around or the business around, which was good for the stock price and things like that. But I moved again to Richmond, Virginia, by the way, right? So one of the themes you're going to hear, if you want a successful career, you're going to have to make sacrifices and choices and decide what really is more important to you. And yeah, we're more in a work from home environment or remote hybrid, but you sometimes have to make some tough choices. And it wasn't perfect. My wife was not happy about Richmond. I don't think we ever loved Richmond. She definitely didn't love Richmond, but it was a great move. And so flash forward to about, 18, 19 months or so into that job, the US for Brinks was the most underperforming country. We had already basically put a leadership team in that they were now about to replace. And the margins had gone down to 1% on $800 million of revenue. 1% is basically not making money, right? That's not good for any company. And Holly asked me if I'd move to Dallas and become the head of HR for the Brinks US business, 800 million, 5,000 employees, most of them, non-union, but hourly. And my wife wanted to go to Dallas, which I was excited about as well, but also as an opportunity to jump into an HR business partner role, which I'd never had before. And I was in that role for 3.5 years. And I could tell you, it was super fun. We completely changed the leadership team, did a lot of things, operational improvement, to move the needle. But in a year, we actually got back to 6% margins and kind of continued that trajectory. So that was great. But it was a very difficult job. And that's what I learned what it's like to be an HR business partner. And what's amazing about it is that sometimes when you're in the talent role, you're one step removed. You're working through an HR business partner who's now with the business leaders in the business meetings, seeing the numbers, understanding the talent, and you're advising and consulting, but you're not making the decisions. When you become the head of HR, even though I wasn't the chief people officer for Brinks, but I was for the US, I had to make decisions every day, right? And you're of course consulting with your team and you're advising, but there are some decisions you're making in HR. And then a lot of times you're advising the business leaders on, if we do this, this is what could happen. Here's the intended consequences, unintended consequences. And I liked being close to the business. So that's where the business background comes in, where I think it's not your MBA, but you have to understand some financials. So Holly, by the way, who's amazing, put me in that role, left and went to Dick's Sporting Goods about 6 months later to be to be the chief people officer for Dick's Sporting Goods. You fast forward 2 or so years later, Holly calls me and I said, hey, Holly, I think I'm ready for a change, right? I think that the mission was there at Brinks was done. I think we're sort of like now plateauing on progress around culture and things like that. And she's like, well, I hired a chief talent officer who's not working out. Would you move to Pittsburgh? And I was like, well, to become the head of talent for Dick's Sporting Goods is a pretty amazing thing. And my wife and family, were open to it and are amazing for that adventure. And we moved to Pittsburgh, and I became the head of talent for Dick's Sporting Goods. And this is where the story gets a little more interesting, I guess. But yeah, it was amazing. Dick's is an amazing company. I can't say one bad thing about it. It's really, really awesome. Loved it. But my family, to be honest, almost 2 years later, were like, it's not the right place. And my mom, who's getting older, my wife's parents are getting older, like, we're not moving to Pittsburgh, but we'll move to Dallas. So we all aligned that we'll move back to Dallas. And so I started to look for jobs in Dallas. And we actually was talking to a couple different companies, but this is where the story gets really wacky. And if I'm boring you guys, please just say, JP, this is too much.
Keep going.
That was
Okay.
awesome.
So the next story was like, okay, great. Well, I was talking to McAfee, which at that point was a private equity owned, obviously cybersecurity company. They were pretty interested, about to make an offer. They lost the funding. And then JCPenney comes out of nowhere, and a recruiter calls me for the JCPenney job. And it was a head of talent, had diversity and inclusion included, which I was never consider myself to be a chief diversity officer, but wanted that experience to say, I think it's important when it's all aligned, and a very big advocate and ally. And so, loved this, my boss there. She's super smart, female CEO, really, actually the business was turning around, and I joined in February of 2020. So I joined 3 weeks before COVID hit. They did move us back to Dallas. So we got back to Dallas, which is pretty awesome for the family, but then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, retail was shut down. And so we had to furlough 75,000 people. Only 3 people remained on my team out of 55. Everyone else was furloughed. And then I worked with another HR VP to work with the business to reduce costs. And we actually eliminated over 1,000 jobs, adding over $60 million of cost over the next 6 months. And then, I got the call from McAfee. And so my boss at McAfee said, hey, JP, it's been a while, 9 months. I finally have the money to go. Do you want to come build out a talent, diversity, learning development function at McAfee? It's high tech, it's remote, it's private equity. This is an awesome opportunity, right? So at that point, by the way, I forgot to mention this, but JCPenney also went for Chapter 11. So we were bankrupt at the time, during this time period, right? So we were under Chapter 11, which is a really interesting experience. That's why we're cutting so much cost. And the future of the business was a little bit uncertain. And it did get purchased, and they're doing fine now. But I went to McAfee. And McAfee, I came in, and I think a month later, went IPO. And then we about 6,000, about 5,000 or so people. And within, 6-7 months, we then sold off one of our business units, and it was to 7,000 people, and 5,000 people left. And then we divested by that many people. And so it was a pretty wild ride. And then we were public at that point. And at the end of the story here is that we're down to about 2,000 people, and we were publicly traded. And then 2 private equity firms in late 2021 purchased the company and took us back private. And when they did that, they cut 40% of the HR team, 40% of the budget. And my entire team was actually cut and eliminated. My job was eliminated. My team was eliminated in early parts of 2022, right? So no fault of anyone's own, just that was a decision they made. And that's something we can talk more about if you want. I mean, the reality is, you've got to future-proof yourself, because you don't know what's going to happen. Especially the higher up you go, you're more expensive, things can happen. But that was business. They treated me fine. I don't regret that move at all. It was a great experience. But technology is a different place, and private equity is interesting. And I've actually always been interested in private equity. And so I kind of pivoted pretty quickly. And a good friend of mine is the head of human capital at a private equity company called Kelso. He said, look, do you want to come and work with me at Kelso on a contract basis across these portfolio companies and understand what mid-market companies are like? Very different. And so I said, let's do it while I'm job searching. How can that hurt? And that actually led to where I'm at now, to being the chief people officer of WilliamsMarston, which is a private equity-backed company we do tax advisory valuation work. And our goal is to grow this business, to the moon and back. Really, really, really cool business, and it's been really fun. So I've gone now from like, we've got, 200 plus people on my team, super small, smaller compared to what you're like talking about at Brinks, but you can really feel the impact, when you make changes and choices, and each hire means so much more in a small company. So going back to my story of the two golfers, I'm not sure there's much left for me to experience at this point because I've sort of done it all in my career. I hope that's valuable. I don't know if it is, but we could definitely talk about where you could do some things differently, and how I've been successful across that way. But that's the full career journey. And now I think I want to stay in private equity for a while and see how that goes.
No, it's a great story, and we always talk about the versatility of IO, and I feel like you definitely showed that. In IO, you could do so many different things, and your story really explains that. Uh, but before we unpack your story, you completed what every friendship has wanted to do. You like kind of started your own business or venture, and you were successful. Like I feel like that's what everybody wants to do. So it's so cool. Um, but the question I had was, you talked about kind of jumping from job to job, and you said at one of the experiences you had, like you weren't as experienced as the other people that applied for the job, and you sort of got lucky, and then you found your place in this position. What are some other things that helped you stand out? Because I know not just me and Brandon, there's a whole bunch of other students applying for internships and entry level positions. And sometimes they ask for, 3 to 5 years of experience. And it kind of seems like a common theme among these applications. How else can you like differentiate yourself besides just having a master's degree and maybe an internship or some other work experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so important. And I think it's going to depend a little bit on who you are, right? So I think you've got to really start to think about, there's certain things that everyone's going to want to see, right? They're going to want to know, like, how do you follow up after the job? Are you asking great questions in the interview? So there's different phases, I guess, Joe. Are you thinking about, am I standing out from a resume perspective, or am I standing out from making a relationship perspective? And I guess what I would just give you an example, and I think it tells you a lot about who I am, but it's a little dated because it was like my early career. So I was like you guys, I got my master's. The PhD was the next phase, kind of all but dissertation, right? And you're supposed to go get a job or internship. And everyone was like hoping the school was going to do this for you. And they all sucked. I mean, I saw the internship and I was like, I don't want that job. And this is before LinkedIn. I know it's like, you can't believe there's something before LinkedIn. And, but actually I paid a guy $100 to a resume writer to get my resume in a good place. And I had like started my own like gum and candy machine business in college. So I try to make my resume as good as possible. But I bet most people today have much better resumes than I have than back in the day. And then I basically networked. And so I just went down and bought two things. One, everyone who was an alumni at my school, I reached out to with like, hey, can I get 15 minutes? This is what I'm looking to do. I'd love to pick your brain, and hear more about your experiences and just share who I am. And people say no, but most people will say yes. And if they say yes, you have to make sure you follow up, because a lot of people will meet me or you'll have a conversation and then they never reach out again. And that's such a loss. And so after that meeting, I always send a thank you note. Thanks so much for doing that. And then I would reach back out in a month with an article, hey, I saw this, might like this. Let's stay in contact. Like, even if they don't respond, I don't really care. It was really all about, how do you make sure that you're building a relationship when others aren't doing that. And then I actually went and bought an email list at the time for Organization Development Network, and basically joined this membership, this organization, kind of like joining PSYOP or a local kind of chapter. And I sent out my resume hard copy to every director in that thing, like 50 people. And I cold called every one of those people. And the guys at Taco Bell picked up. And I said, hey, I'm looking for an internship or project work. And they're like, well, yeah, we may have an internship, but I don't know, but why don't you come in? Or let's set up an interview. And so they liked me, but they said, we don't have anything today. And for 6 months, I sent them articles like once a month, followed up, and then ended up through my networking, got an internship at Disney. And it was when they're building the new Disney California Adventure theme park. And I got the job, right? They got, it was like, it was hourly wage. It wasn't a big deal. It was like 6 months. It was great to get it. But I said, hey, after the internship to the Disney folks, could I work here or could this be expanded? And they said, probably not. This is probably just a 6-month internship. And so most people probably would have taken the internship at Disney and that would have been it, right? Not me. So I left Disney. I immediately called Mark Wilson, who's the senior director of Taco Bell, still in contact with Mark today. Called him and said, "Hey, Mark, it's JP. I just got offered a job at Disney. I don't want to work at Disney." And he said, "Wait, have you started there?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay, come in tomorrow. We're going to make you an offer." And I came in the next day and got a $30,000 salary, right, as an intern. And that's the rest is history. And the point of that is just it's perseverance and really trying to build a relationship, but be genuine about it. I think that's the most important thing. If you're talking about in the interview process, like you only get this very short period of time to make an impression, right? So show up prepared, know about the company, really think about the questions you're asking. Don't use generic questions. Don't say, "Tell me about the culture." That is a pet peeve. And you'll see a LinkedIn post on this in a week or two about how I hate that question. But really be more tactical and be more strategic. Try to stand out from other people who aren't maybe putting the homework in, right? Because at the end of the day, if I'm hiring you as an intern or your first job, an analyst, whatever it is, I'm hiring you for your potential. You have no experience. When you hire me, I'm old, you're hiring for experience, definitely not potential, right? But when you're young, all you have is potential. And so show me that potential. Bring in work. If you have work products and you want to show me, do it. Break the mold. Like say, "Hey, I want to leave you a deck of something I've done before. I have a podcast, check it out." Right? How are you differentiating yourself is really important. And then relationships is the key because it's all about trust. And so I think leveraging that network, and obviously I believe in that. You have this incredible network and opportunity now because of the podcast, which is why podcasting is kind of incredible. But I love the fact that you meet people you never get to meet except through podcasting, right? But I think you can do that just through grad school, through your parents, friends, networks, whatever it is. That's super important, and you should leverage that.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And as somebody who is like a little bit younger and trying to figure that out too, as a master's student, I definitely can see that as valuable. I know Joe and I both are like, we're both either having internships right now or currently looking for them. And that process of like applying and interviewing, it was intensive. Like you go through it and you have to put in a lot of work, and definitely I think you can feel it on the way out. But it sounds like when you do it and you do it thoughtfully, it's a little bit more rewarding too. And with that moving forward too, throughout your career and you're trying out these positions, like how often did you use the network that you created to leverage that? Because it sounded like you were utilizing it pretty often to like either find a new career or like try something new. Like, so was that network something that you could utilize pretty often?
Definitely. I mean, network's really important. And I think, even though you might say, "Well, gosh, all my connections are, young like myself and, up and coming, and we don't have the same kind of connections I'm going to have, right? Being, my age or my experience." But the reality is it's so important to be a good networker, right? There's people who only call you when they're looking for a job or when they need something. And, it's something Angela Lane, who's been on the podcast guest, she's actually the VP talent of AbbVie. She talks about being a proactive, positive networker, right? Someone you want to network with because they're giving value. I think if you're just taking a lot, it's not going to work so much. But building real relationships is critical. I think people want to know that you're interested in them and they want to help you, and so that's great. But I also don't think you if a cold reach out and say, "Hey, I'm really interested in this role. I'd love if I could learn more about the culture or whatever it is." Like most people will say yes to that as long as the ask isn't too much, and you follow up. I think you can build that network. But throughout your career, yes, stay in contact with people is important, and it comes back to reputation. I mean, the reality is, it's kind of like your integrity, who your reputation is, and how you treat people, whether you leave or not, really does set a tone in terms of what your success will be later in life. And some people just don't think about that, but I'd be intentional in networking.
Being intentional with it is so valuable. And I want to ask this because we always talk about this in terms of students, and obviously you have very extensive experience, JP, bringing it back to the students and what they can do. Like when you're looking at your career and you've made these changes, you've gone through all these different opportunities, what can students do to like be present in the moment and absorb all that information, because I feel like you're getting so much experience and you're trying out all these jobs that like you have to make sure that you're also getting the valuable experience from it too.
Oh my gosh, for sure. But I think, and I just read something about this. I don't know if we was talking about this a little bit, but don't put too much pressure on yourself, early in your career. Like, I think we're always like, we want to get ahead, we want to get promoted. Really be in the moment. Like, think about, how do you deliver and add value now, right? How do you be the best you can be at that level, and what does that mean, right? So going above and beyond, you get an example. You want to stand out. No one asks you to do this, but you go to a meeting, say, I'll take notes, right? Or at the end of the meeting, just send out the notes to your boss and say, hey, I took notes for you. Here's the actions. Like, get good at email communication. It's always about doing a little bit more, and that's how you're going to stand out and learn more. Because the reality is, most people are going to want to get an investment in you if they believe you have potential. And they're going to believe you have potential because you're performing. And that performance will then want me to invest more in you, because I don't want to invest in someone who I think is not really going to put the effort in. I'm not going to want to have conversations and coach you if I feel like you're not going to really listen. If I tell you to read a book or listen to a podcast or, whatever, and you're like, yeah, I didn't do it, I'm probably not going to give you another book idea or another article, right? So you have to then be open to that feedback and be a sponge and then ask for it. And the interns, I mean, I've had a lot of successful interns that have gone on and done really well. And I think it's because, they're open to that. It's not me. I mean, they're great people, but they wanted to learn and grow. And I think that's the key. So I'd say go above and beyond, do more than being expected. So say, hey, is there another project I can pick up? Is there something else that needs to be fixed? Is there something that no one wants to do, but I have a skill set that I could do? Do those things. That's important. And then you have to share that work. You have to brag a little bit, frankly, brag in a positive way, because no one else is going to do it for you. So you have to kind of make sure people know your successes. You can't be the intern that was awesome, quiet, did a ton of work, but people are like, yeah, what did Brandon and Joe do this summer? Like, I like those guys, but you got to be like, hey, I'm working on this. Wherever you go, you need to have a little bit of a sales pitch. These are the 3 things I'm working on. Go ask people if they can give you feedback on it, etc. Right? So there's a little bit of social skill that goes into this, because I mean, I'm not saying I've been successful because of me 100%. A lot of this is luck. It's timing, but you have to put the work in, and that preparation, helps you get the opportunities when they show up.
It's great advice, especially for interns, because I feel like as interns, rather than maybe like an entry level position, you get opened up to other projects that you might, if I was just like a compensation analyst, but if I was an intern, I might be able to do some other HR type things. Uh, so as you said, like being that sponge and being able to do those types of things. Um, One other thing that you brought up when you were switching through jobs was about fit. And we actually just had on Andre Martin talking
Oh,
about.
I love Andre. We're friends. Yeah, he's
I
awesome.
wonder where we got the inspiration from.
Yeah, he's the best.
It's
He's the
definitely from you.
best. Yeah, he's great.
Uh, but it was really cool to hear him talking about finding that right fit and finding like what kind of position you should apply for. Was that something going through your mind early in your career? Because we actually even did a LinkedIn post on it and talking about, is fit something you think about? Because I know early in my career, and it's just my personal belief, of course it's something I think about, but if I get a really cool opportunity for a good salary and it's something that might propel my career forward, even though maybe the culture fit or the way the company's run is not exactly what I'm looking for, I'll probably end up taking that position. What was that kind of mindset for you when you were looking at these jobs?
That's a great question. I've actually thought about this a lot, and I think Andre's onto something. I think he's actually done a really great job with the right fit, wrong fit. I think, though, to your point, when you're early in your career, here's my advice. Look, you've got to think brand and reputation first. So, one of my favorite books on careers, it's old. It's called The 5 Patterns of Extraordinary Careers. And it's a terrific book. And it really talks about the fact that, going big early, like having a good name on your resume, is going to help you. Just the reality is, we live in a culture where we categorize things, right? And so if you're starting at Google, right, I think you must be Google talent. Just because you got it doesn't mean that you're Google talent, but you've got Google in the resume, right? You went to Harvard, you must be brilliant. Okay. But there's a lot of brilliant people who went to, Ball State University or, whatever. I'm not Ball State's compared to Harvard. I have no idea. But any other state university where I went to school, there's a lot of smart people. So I think if you can get take a big job, you should take it, of course, right? And know that, frankly, not every job is perfect, but not every job has to be forever. So I think you got to think about, what is this job about? Like, what do I want to get out of this role? Why am I doing it? I love Taco Bell. It was a great fit. It was a very comfortable culture. I mean, the chief diversity and inclusion officer there, James Fripp, and I are friends. He was an HR business partner when I was there. He stayed his entire career at Yum, and I get it. It's an awesome company. But for me, I wanted to push myself, right? Great fit there. There's other companies I've had that I won't talk about that weren't as good a fit, to be honest. But it's still work, but I always look at how I can make an impact. So I look at the fit more of like, is the role interesting? Am I making an impact? Because every job, frankly, has things you're not going to like. There's going to be bosses who are not perfect, right? Those things are going to be there for you. But earlier in your career, I would prioritize, if you're ambitious, a better role, but more importantly, Joe, and I should have said this, a better manager. Like, who you work for really means a lot. The first 10 to 15 years of your career, it's all about learning. That's it. Learn as much as you can. Read every article, read every, report that someone puts out, read all the books, talk to your boss, right? Learn as much as you possibly can. And then you be more of a critical consumer of what's out there as you get older, because you're having opinions and experiences. But bosses are really important, especially early in your career. So that was kind of going back to the Disney thing. My Disney boss was like, no, this is just a job. My Taco Bell boss was, no, you can grow here. You can do your dissertation here. You can have a career at Taco Bell. I think that makes a big difference.
100%. My one of my past internships was exactly like that. They invest in the people, and you feel welcomed. I know Brandon and I talk a lot about with the other students in our cohort that haven't had great bosses or managers, and they're kind of thinking like, I don't really want to stay here. Like, I feel like I'm not learning anything.
It is a good transition, though, because we've been talking, and I feel like we've gotten a lot of really important nuggets from you, JP, about advice for students. But I'd like for us to hone in on one of them. And so, as like we sit here and we talk about how we can help students out there who are trying to find their way into IO, like, what is one piece of advice that you would have for them?
Yeah, my one piece of advice for IO psychs, honestly, it's just put the hours in. I mean, you've got to outwork somebody else. I mean, if you're really ambitious, I get it. We want work-life balance, and I'm not saying you're going to work 100 hours a week, but performance is relative. And, you may think you're crushing it, but if the intern next door or the analyst next door is working a little harder, putting a little bit more getting more production, a little bit faster on their reports, or whatever it is, guess what? That person is winning in the performance battle, right? So I just say put the work in. You've got to really commit to working hard for a long time to grow your career. I mean, you can harvest when you get older, and you've got relationships and you've got experiences to fall back on. But when you're first starting out, you've got to really make a difference and stand out, right? Because there aren't unlimited jobs and there's competition for those jobs. So that's one. And the second one, I think, is just the relationships, right? It's always building relationships and network with people who you don't think would network with you. Reach out to the CFO in your company and say, can I buy you lunch? I want to understand how to read a P&L, right? They're going to love doing that. People love to share knowledge, and, like, you guys reached out to me. I'm like, I'm happy to do this. I love doing this, and it's fun.
That's great advice. Like, we do talk on this show a lot about networking, but the outworking your fellow employees is a newer one. And I actually kind of like it because, it is competitive out there, and especially depending on whenever you're getting out of grad school, it could be a lot easier or a lot harder to get a job. So regardless of that, if you're putting in the work, you'll reap the benefits at some point. And JP, I think you highlighted that very well. And like, obviously we see that with your career path and all the work you put in on the back end to like send thank you notes or going out and networking. Like, it's something that I think a lot of students can learn from, for sure.
Appreciate that. I'd also put a plug in for Mark Efron's book, 8 Steps to High Performance. It's an awesome book, and it's well worth the read. Like, I wish I had that book when I was, 20 years ago or so. So check it out.
Yeah, we definitely will.
Or better yet, ask me and I'll introduce you to Mark and see if he'll come on the podcast. So there you go.
Even better. But it is some wonderful advice. We really appreciate you coming on today. I'm super excited for everyone to hear about this episode, just because you have such a interesting career path, and how successful you've been. I feel like a lot of students will be very excited to hear about it.
100%.
Awesome. Well, hey guys, I appreciate what you're doing. I think keep rocking this. You're making a difference. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining us.
So what a great episode with JP Elliott right there. We always talk about the versatility and everything different that you could do in the field of IO. So actually having someone on and talking about everything that they did in IO is really cool.
Yeah, I feel like it was really awesome because we got to hear the different pathways that he took. And then as the episode progresses, you really get to hear like the tie-in to like what it's done for his career. So we were really able to like find value in like every little bit of transition that he had.
No, yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to kind of delve more into his his LinkedIn and like look at the companies he worked for, and just kind of see the other positions that he had. And I'm excited for the other listeners, especially those students, to kind of hear what they can accomplish in this field, that like what they can really do with like the internships and positions that they get.
Yeah, and I'm gonna add one more thing. JP said this offline, but it's something that is very valuable as well. Um, he said everyone he went and got his master's and PhD with is like working and doing really good things, being very successful. So, as students out there who are trying to make their way, like this path is something that we can all find success in, and success looks different to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Brandon. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll hope to see you next week as well.
See you guys.